how do you build a non-fiction book? And the word build is chosen very specifically because sometimes we less write a book than we compile a book. So this is very specifically for an author who is a non-fiction author who wants to write a professional book, something that's about their area of expertise, something potentially you've taught or spoken about for many years. And then the question becomes, how do you take this body of knowledge and what's the best way to present it to the reader? So this is a second video in my series of first deciding what book you're going to be writing. And then the second step, which is we're speaking about now, is to understand that books are built on chapters. Non-fiction books are built on chapters. So the very next step is to devise your absolutely basic table of contents. And I always want authors to have a list of between 12 and 21 chapters in a non-fiction book. And this really is something I want you to just do in point form. So pen and paper, scribble it down. Chapter 1, this is about why you should consider fasting. Chapter 2, how do you approach fasting? Chapter 3, myths about fasting. So already, as you start to just do this point form chapter list, you're starting to devise content buckets, which are chapter headings in which all these ideas that you speak about and teach about are suddenly going to have a place in which they can land. And this is the really unavoidable step of writing a nonfiction book, is you have to decide the topics. And it is harder than it seems because when you choose what your chapter titles are going to be, you're also considering the fact that you want to take your your readers down a little bit of a journey. So there's a sense of logic. As I, said with this book on fasting, how would logically you approach the subject matter of fasting or of accounting or of starting a meditation practice? So we always think about, what's logical, really? How logically can I spell this out to the reader? And don't overthink this process, really. People get very caught on this chapter list. It's really the very first stepping stone of a book. And I really challenge you to do this in under an hour, to come with a load of lists, point form, and move it even into an Excel spreadsheet. I love to work on Excel because what we're going to do is once you have those basic chapters, you're going to start building them out. And what do I mean by building them out? I mean, you're going to take each one of those chapters and you're going to ask yourself, well, what are the elements that I need to put in this chapter? So if, for example, we're having the chapter about the 10 myths of fasting, what you may want to do in that chapter is have a different style of writing. You may want a list form chapter in which you very specifically list a myth and then debunk it underneath. So that would be a really simple way of tackling a chapter like that. But if you come to a more theoretical chapter, maybe we want to talk about the theory behind fasting, what happens to the body, what happens to the brain. You would not use a point form kind of list like that. You would then get into theory and you'd get into a more of a narrative chapter in which you unpack ideas and science. But equally, there may be chapters which may be personal. So very advised is, you dive in initially in a book with your own experience of fasting. So if we take a book structure, very first chapter would be a personal one, and it would really take the reader through this journey you've lived of fasting or of exercise or of mindfulness or whatever you are writing about. So you're going to start potentially very personal. You're going to pull back and bring in some theory, and then you're going to offer some various reading material. And then through the middle of the book, very often what you're doing is you're unpacking the story. So if it was fasting, it would be different, aspects of the fast, potentially different phases. You may want to then offer the reader some ideas of fasts they can go on. Potentially it's a 12-hour fast, a 24-hour fast, etc. And each of those may be a chapter which has its own dynamic and elements and recipes or anecdotes or stories or tasks or reflections you're asking of the reader. So not to get confused, your very first step is the basic contents list. And I don't mind if it's 12 chapters, if it's 21 chapters, or if it's 60 chapters, as long as you are showing me very, very clearly that your book has a structure. I, as reader, can understand the structure. It's something I may quite like to dive into, and I can see from the very descriptive chapter titles there is a progression, and that I can choose some chapters, and I can even leave out some chapters that don't appeal to my reading taste.